So you talked and you touched on this towards the end, Susan, sort of that goes to the issue of quality of data. What do we know from these? What are the specific kinds of practices in a school that might be working? I remember when the 2009 study first came out, the Credo study you both talked about, I reached out to John Chubb and said, what do you think? There's just something wrong with this. I'm not understanding how we could possibly have thrown all of these data points from all these different states into a Cuisinart, shooken up, and had this result. And he wrote me and said, the study, ambitious as it is, covers a few years of a child's education, 3 max. Given that school switching of any kind tends to yield a first-year drop from which students need to recover, it's misleading to ask how a sector of schools is performing if one only looks at the initial years. The study finds kids learn increasingly more in charters relatively to traditional public schools in years 2 and 3. A more fair look at relative performance would have covered a school career for a kid, not just the early experience. You both referred to this. And note, making matters worse, the sample of kids with 1 year of experience is larger than the multi-year experiences. So I raised that issue from John in 2009 because when the states give you data as researchers, something that I'm just learning a little bit now, and I know most of us don't think about, is we assume that the data has all this stuff. Like, we assume that when you're looking at these schools, you know how long they've been in existence. You know, for example, you referred to differences in state law. Some schools start in 4th grade. Some start in 9th grade. Some are starting like in 2nd grade. I mean, it's weird, right? So are there those factors as part of the data, and how much does quality vary, or even intensity of data vary state to state?
A lot. So a lot of that stuff we do know, I think, in most of the data sets. Like how, and if you don't know it from the state kind of handing it to you, you can find out pretty easily how long the school's been around and how long you can see how long the student has been in there, right? And that's something that their estimates, do. And there is kind of, it would be hard for me to think that kind of a tempered result in charter schools is coming from school switching. I mean, I think school switching does kind of reduce, there is a mobility kind of negative thing that happens. But a lot of what we see, I mean, what Sue was showing up with we do see kind of year 1 effects that kind of grow over time. So I don't think that would really explain to me kind of the negative results, the less positive results we're seeing in Credo. I mean, some data sets are really rich and robust, some are less so. I mean, some states have been at this longer than other states, and some states have the lottery information easier to get than others. So there's variation in that, and I think, and I think you're right. I mean, having a little more uniformity of that would be helpful to us, which is not always their main priority.
Agreed.
Okay. David.
Hi, I'm from Philadelphia, run a charter in Philadelphia, and one of the things that I see is that for the high schools, at least, they have so many selective admissions high schools. There's about 1/3 of the public high schools are, in fact, a little more than that. You have to have certain qualifications to get in, and they're pretty extensive qualifications. If you look at the comparison between the top charters and the top public schools, the college enrollment data is not very far apart. It's probably like 5 percentage points, which isn't too far. So I look at these comparisons when they've kind of loaded their side, and we still come up comparatively. That really shows that we're doing a good job. But when you put that in the paper, it never looks like a good job. It looks like they're doing better than you, and that's all anybody ever sees. How do you address something like that? How do we get around that data problem?
I touched on this, but I think, is this on? The college enrollment, 0-1 for whether somebody's gone to college is not a very useful metric at this point. College enrollment rates are very high, and part of the college enrollment is, say, at for-profit colleges like ITT or Corinthian, and that when you're looking at just a college attendance percentage, that's in there with the 4-year colleges, for example. So academic, but the dropout rate on average across all college entrants is 50%. 50% of all of those who attempt college actually never get out. and it varies enormously by type of institution. So it's 95% for some community colleges and some for-profits, and it's 5% for some excellent four-year schools. So focusing on the quality of the schools attended by the students and their persistence, I think, is more important. How many of them show up for the second year, the third year, the fourth year, get a degree? Many states, actually just about all states, have the capacity to provide this kind of information to districts and to schools. So during the recession, the feds made a condition of state fiscal stabilization funds that states determine what share of their high school graduates go to college, what share of their high school graduates complete 18 months of college. And to do this, states matched on either data from their public systems, their public university and college systems, or from the National Student Clearinghouse. And that's what we've used in Massachusetts and in Michigan to track whether these students have gone to college.
Idea. In Philadelphia, they told us they can't track the chain of custody.
You could do it for your own students.
We do it. We have it, but they said, well, we take our report to them, and that's what they said. They can't track the chain of custody. I never heard anything so ridiculous, but that's what they said. But the point here is this. You're right. If it's tracking how people go through college, then it's meaningful. If it's just that one first fall thing, that could be anything. That could be trade school, that could be barber college, that could be anything. And we need to track the quality of the things, and that's just not happening. Thank you.
Hi, Susan. I'm Tim Kelly, State Representative from Michigan. I chair K-12 approach in the House. I sit on ed policy as well. How come I have to come to Washington, D.C. to hear about a study done in Michigan charter schools?
Come on down to Ann Arbor. No, I'm kidding. We're still working on it. We don't have the results yet, is what's going on. But, you know, we have worked closely with the statewide charter organization and visited every charter school in the state to get this information.
Has there been any influence in trying to sitting on this study?
No.
All right.
No.
Thank you.
No.
Good morning. I'm Ron Russo from Caesar Rodney Institute in Delaware. And I would like to piggyback on the very last thing you had brought up about the traditional schools benefiting from charters. In Delaware, it was the governor, who was Tom Carper at the time. It was the Department of Public Instruction, and it was a consortium of 6 businesses headed up by the DuPont Company who actually got together and passed the charter school law in Delaware in 1995. Now, it's interesting in that I was hired to open the first charter school. And, you know, we're talking about education reform this morning, but I just want you to understand, at least in Delaware, the main thing they were talking about, and this goes to, I believe you're involved with economics, I saw your title. And if you take a look, I was hired and I was told flat out, the reason for what they were doing in Delaware was for the state's economic well-being. They said they wanted to attract business, they wanted to retain business, they were worried about real estate values, taxes, crime rates. You go on and on. And what this does is it broadens the support for educational reform. Why? If you look at charter schools or traditional schools, if you don't have a kid in school, what real interest do you have in what's going on? Well, in Delaware, they were trying to give you the idea that if you lived in Delaware, if you worked in Delaware, if you had an investment in Delaware, you had an interest, because I was told that the existing public school system was a liability to the economic health of the state. So that helps to bring it up. Now, we're talking about measuring success. I just gave you some indicators I haven't heard anybody talk about. We're talking about how the kids do. Well, you know, they go through the elementary school, they go through middle school, they go through high school and college. That's not what we were focusing on in Delaware in 1995. We were looking at, well, what is that going to do to people's incomes? What's that going to do to the taxes? That's something that you can measure, and you can measure regularly. You can see if you're going up, down, sideways, or whatever. So the idea for charter schools wasn't to create a number of charter schools or a competitive school system. As a matter of fact, in Delaware, it was never intended to have a lot of charter schools. Why? And here's where it comes. This is the big piece, if you will. The whole idea was something called systemic change. It had to do with changing the way the traditional schools operated. It was to customize schools, not standardize them. It was to shift operating authority and responsibility into the building with the building principal, which we would call CEOs, Chief Education Officer, working with distributed education, working with the teachers. It was to take the authority from school boards, from the districts, and put it into the local building. Now, how are you going to hold them accountable? We're talking about, in charter schools, you take a look at what? Enrollment? Well, think about it. We're saying to the parents, you are the ones who will have control, you have say. And by the way, the main customer of education is parents. They're the primary clients. And I would offer for everyone's consideration, a big supporter, or perhaps an ally would be the best way to express it, would be the business community. If you get them involved, and I know we talk about in education, you talk about how legislation is passed and how you talk to the people. And I certainly wouldn't want anybody to think that I believe things are rigged, but I'm originally from Atlantic City. That's rude, folks, that's rude. The answer is, I happen to believe the economic piece is the critical piece. You said in that headline, or what is the heading, shocking. Economics is shocking, we ought to employ it.
There's a question mark in the question, I'm going to answer it.
Go.
I'm going to decide that the question is, why haven't we looked at the effects on earnings more frequently? So here's another place where you can help to make all this research more relevant. Very few states have connected their education data systems to their earnings data systems. So Massachusetts, which is in general good on a lot of ed reform issues, on research issues, has not done so, for example. So a demand for that kind of research might help to make it happen. We would love to, in Massachusetts and in Michigan, for that matter, look at the effect of school quality of charter schools on earnings. I agree that that is what matters, not what diploma they have, but their well-being as adults. And we've got a data shortage in that area.
Yeah, it's not because people like us don't want to look at those things. In fact, there's a huge race going on to see how many people can look at how many long-term outcomes. And part of it is because the data that doesn't match. It only matches in a few places, and part of it's because the reforms are just now kind of have been around long enough that we can start look at those things. I mean, at AEFP last year, right? I could not count the number of papers that looked at these kind of longer term outcomes. It's what we're up to now.
My name's Jim Gunner. Thank you for your work. I did a quick scan to see if Ted Coulter is in the room because I want to do this justice.
He's going to be on Skype later.
But I want to go back to the base premise, and that's the question, what's better, charter schools or traditional public schools? And I think Ted would argue that it's the wrong question. And he's been putting it in the form of what's faster, humans or animals? So what's faster, humans or animals? And you think about that answer, and it'd be it depends, right? Long race, short race, lots of turns, climbing, can you fly, can you use a car, etc. Do you think that in some ways we're trying to ask a question that's just flawed on its premise?
I think it's, this comes back to, so say you do get an average effect for Massachusetts or for the country, could you then take that and know anything about some randomly picked charter school that you then look at? Is it going to have the effect that you got on average? Probably not, right? It's a hugely, traditional public schools are hugely variable. Can you answer the question, do traditional public schools work? And the answer is going to be, well, yeah, in some places they do, and in some places they don't. And I do think it's a coherent question, though, to ask, in a given setting, in a given school district, in a given state, where you've got a set of traditional public schools and you introduce charter schools, do students at the charter schools perform better? That is something, it's a coherent question to ask, but it does need this perspective that you're referring to, that you can't just sort of say, the nationwide statistics, I would say, are not very helpful. Charters are located in different places than the rest of the country. We don't have charters in many suburbs. You don't have charters in many rural areas. So you have to drill in and look more closely at comparable school districts.
Well, and also the only place where we had one of the exciting things going on about charter schools as a reform, but also as far as research is concerned, is we now have some pockets where the charter schools are much bigger players than they ever have been. I mean, the only place where we have every school a charter school district is New Orleans, and so far the evidence on that has been pretty positive, right? But it's kind of the only example we have of that. But now we have some cities where 30, 40 growing percentages are being, so the kind of the every school a charter school mantra is getting closer, right? And I think part of that, it would have been impossible. Like, there was never a conversation of, during the early stages, I doubt, like, the goal could have been every school a charter school, but the idea that a whole state would become a charter school, charter schooling, I don't think was ever really on the table. So we had to kind of look at, so the first thing you have to do is adopt it and then see how it's going, right? If we give schools autonomy, are we seeing positive effects? I think overall we're seeing, yeah. But then the next part of that question is, well, what are they doing with that autonomy and what is kind of more and less effective? And then have the conversation of, can we really expand this? And that's where we are in a lot of these places, I think, and that's where we're getting pushback in places like Massachusetts. And that's, I think, where we are, and I think the conversation should be about trying to expand the sectors as we go.
So I know I'm standing dangerously between the sessions and in lunch, but the follow-up then is that charters are an institutional innovation is the way Ted would describe it, versus a learning program. And so part of where I hear you going is we could actually compare college prep charter schools to college prep traditional schools versus the institutional structure, traditional public versus charter. Am I hearing that right?
Well, what we do is we compare students attending charter schools to the schools that they would have to how they would have performed had they gone to the school they otherwise would have attended, right? So that might be another college prep school. It might be a different type of school, right? And then part of what the research is trying to do now is figure out, well, which charter schools, because charter schools, because they are a choice reform, right, they vary substantially from each other. So we can start looking at, well, where do we tend to find the more or less positive effects, right? With part of that idea, what should we bring into the traditional public school sector, right, assuming that it continues to exist. I do think that, so overall comparisons of charter schools and public schools are, we have to do them, but they are somewhat misleading too, because charter schools are designed to be very different from each other.
Charter schools are a license to try something different, right? And the fact that we've given them this name of charter schools makes it sound like a more solid thing than it is, but it really is just the freedom to try something different from what the local traditional public schools are doing. And so it's not a well-formed question to say what is that thing, but you can say what is the result. So you were given a license and you did different things depending on where you were and what your goals were. Were the outcomes good? So I would say focus on what outcomes are. Has the license to experiment led to better results for students? That is a coherent question.